In a small, dusty village in eastern Africa, a young girl named Amina dreamed of something simple, to sit in a classroom and learn. But every time she picked up a book, the elders laughed at her. "Girls belong in the kitchen," they said. Her father tore her only notebook into pieces, saying school was a waste of time for a girl. Amina cried that night, but she didn't stop. She collected old scraps of paper from the trash and hid them under her bed. Every evening, when everyone slept, she lit a small candle and taught herself to read and write. Her hands were often burned from the candle wax, but her heart burned brighter with hope. Sometimes she listened to the lessons from outside the school window, trying to memorize every word the teacher said. The boys laughed at her, calling her foolish, but she kept coming back. She believed that one day, her dream would matter. Years passed, and Amina never gave up. She found small jobs, saved money, and slowly worked her way through school. Her hard work took her farther than anyone imagined. Many years later, Amina returned to her village, not as the poor girl with torn papers, but as a teacher with her own school. The same men who once laughed at her now stood outside, their hats in their hands, waiting humbly. They had only one request: "Please, Teacher Amina, teach our daughters too." When Amina was 10 years old, she had one dress that she loved more than anything. It was bright yellow, with little white flowers that made her feel special every time she wore it. One morning, she couldn't find it. Her mother had quietly sold it in the market to buy a second-hand math book. When Amina saw the old, torn book in her mother's hands, she didn't know whether to cry or smile. Her mother looked at her gently and said, "This book will take you further than that dress ever could." The villagers laughed when they heard what her mother had done. "No man will marry a girl who reads," they said. "Books don't cook food." Amina's mother only smiled and whispered to her, "Then you will marry your dreams instead." Those words stayed in Amina's heart forever. Every night, she opened that old book and studied by the light of a small oil lamp. The pages smelled of dust and hope. She solved problems she didn't even understand at first, but she kept trying. When the rains came and her friends played outside, Amina stayed under the roof, protecting her book from getting wet. When her classmates gave up, she pushed harder. She believed her mother's words more than the villagers' laughter. Slowly, her grades began to rise, and one day, her teacher told her she was the best student in the class. That moment changed everything. Years went by, and Amina's journey was not easy. She faced hunger, long walks to school, and many days without shoes. But she never stopped learning. When she got older, she earned a scholarship to study at a university far from her village. The night before she left, her mother held her and said, "Go, my daughter. Show them what a girl with a book can do." 15 years after the day her mother sold that yellow dress, Amina returned to her village wearing something even more beautiful, a graduation gown. The same villagers who once mocked her now gathered to see her. Some clapped. Some cried. Her mother stood in the front, tears shining in her eyes. Amina bent down and placed her graduation cap on her mother's head. "This is yours," she said softly. Not long after, Amina started teaching children under a large mango tree in the middle of the village. She didn't have a classroom or desks, only her voice and her love for learning. Someone took a photo of her one day, standing under the tree, teaching with joy and pride. That photo spread across the country. People everywhere were moved by her story, the girl whose mother sold her favorite dress so she could learn. And when Amina saw the photo go viral, she smiled. She whispered, "Mama was right. I did marry my dreams." When Amina was 12, she loved numbers more than anything. She could spend hours solving sums on the dusty ground with a stick, dreaming of the day she'd be allowed to sit in a real classroom. But one afternoon, everything changed. The headmaster caught her sneaking into class without permission. He looked down at her and said harshly, "A girl can't solve equations. Go home and help your mother." His words cut deep, but what hurt more was the laughter that followed. The boys in the room laughed loudly, and Amina ran out with tears in her eyes. That night, she couldn't sleep. She looked up at the stars and whispered to herself, "I will prove him wrong." The next morning, instead of giving up, she stood behind the school building and peeked through a cracked window. Every day, she stood there quietly, copying the teacher's notes in her small notebook, the one she made from old papers tied with string. Sometimes she couldn't hear clearly, sometimes the chalk dust made her eyes burn, but she never missed a single lesson. Rain or shine, she stood there, watching, learning, believing. One day, a kind teacher named Mr. Odong noticed her. He saw the same little girl behind the window day after day, eyes full of determination. He walked outside and asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" Amina held her notebook close and whispered, "Because I want to learn." The teacher smiled and said, "Then you will." From that day, he began teaching her after class. He gave her old textbooks, helped her with equations, and treated her like she belonged. Months later, Amina entered a regional math competition, secretly. No one expected her to win. But when they announced the results, her name was at the top. Amina Lul, first place. The same headmaster who once threw her out was sitting in the front row. His face froze as the crowd cheered. For the first time, Amina stood on that school stage, not as an unwanted girl, but as a champion. Years passed. Amina went on to university, studying education and mathematics. She became one of the brightest students in her program. Her dream had grown bigger than herself. She wanted to make sure no other girl would ever be told she couldn't learn. When she finally returned to her old village, the school looked smaller than she remembered, but her heart felt full. That morning, the villagers gathered as she walked through the front gate, not as the poor girl with a broken notebook, but as Principal Amina Lul. The children stood in lines, clapping, their faces full of hope. Inside the headmaster's old office, a new sign hung on the wall, "Every child can learn." Today, her students score higher than anyone in the district, and when people ask how she did it, she smiles and says, "Because once, I learned through a window." The morning Amina received her scholarship letter was the brightest and hardest day of her life. She had waited for that envelope for months, praying under the stars every night that it would come. When the postman finally handed it to her, her hands trembled. She opened it slowly, and when she saw the words, "You have been awarded a full scholarship," her heart jumped. It felt like the world had opened a door just for her. She ran to show her family, but not everyone was happy. Her uncle, a strict man with a deep voice, frowned and said, "Education will curse you. Girls who study forget their place." Amina's heart sank, but she stood firm. "Uncle," she said softly, "I won't forget who I am. I just want to learn." He shook his head and blocked the door. "If you go, don't come back." Her mother, standing in the corner, wiped silent tears from her eyes but whispered, "Go, my child. Go and make your dreams real." With a small backpack, $3, and her mother's blessing, Amina left that morning. The road was long, dusty, and full of fear. She didn't know how she'd survive, but she carried something stronger than money, a burning promise to return when the world knew her name. There were nights she slept hungry, days when she wanted to give up, but every time she looked at her scholarship letter, she remembered why she had started. At school, everything was new, the city lights, the big classrooms, the strange accents. She felt small, lost, and alone. Some students laughed at her worn shoes and simple clothes. But Amina studied harder than anyone. She read late into the night, borrowed old books, and worked part-time cleaning dorm rooms to afford her meals. There were times she cried quietly, missing her mother and home, but she never went back. Her dream kept her alive. Years passed, and the girl who left her village with almost nothing became one of the top students in the country. She was chosen to represent her university at a national education conference, where she gave a speech about hope, courage, and the power of a single dream. Reporters wrote about her. Her name spread across the country. Amina Lul, the girl who never gave up. One bright afternoon, Amina returned to her village, just like she had promised. She didn't come quietly. The road that once looked dusty now sparkled with banners and songs. The whole village gathered, clapping, singing, crying. But it wasn't her uncle standing at the gate anymore, it was a crowd waiting to welcome her home. As Amina stepped out of the car in her graduation gown, voices rose around her, "Our daughter made us proud." Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering, "I told you, my child, education is never a curse." And for the first time, even her uncle bowed his head in silence. When Amina first said she wanted to build a school in her village, everyone laughed. The men sitting under the big tree chuckled and shook their heads. "You can't teach with broken walls," they mocked. "You don't even have enough money to buy chalk." But Amina didn't argue. She just smiled. Deep inside, she remembered how she once studied under a tree, how she used scraps of paper and candlelight, and how she promised herself that no child should ever have to go through that again. The land she found was rough and dry, with stones scattered everywhere. People said it was useless. But to Amina, it was the start of something beautiful. She knelt down, touched the soil, and whispered, "Here, children will learn." She didn't have money, but she had determination. She took pictures of the empty land and shared her dream online. She wrote, "I want to build a school with mud, hope, and love." Her post began to spread. Strangers from different countries saw her story and started donating. Some sent a few dollars, others sent messages saying, "Keep going, Amina." With every small donation, she bought bricks, one by one. She carried water herself, mixed mud with her hands, and worked under the hot sun with a few volunteers. At night, she sat under a lantern, writing thank you notes to every person who helped. Slowly, walls began to rise where there was once only dust. Children came every day, watching in excitement, dreaming of the moment they could sit inside a real classroom. Months turned into years, and the small foundation grew into a beautiful little school. The walls were still simple, and the roof was made of tin, but to Amina, it was more precious than gold. When the final coat of paint dried, she stood back and whispered, "We did it." On the day of the opening, the whole village gathered. The same people who once mocked her came dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore clean shirts, the women wrapped bright scarves around their heads, and children ran around laughing, their faces glowing with joy. Amina's mother stood in the front row, tears in her eyes. Amina held a small red ribbon and a pair of scissors in her trembling hands. She looked at the crowd and said softly, "This school belongs to all of us. It started with a dream and your hands made it real." When she cut the ribbon, cheers filled the air. The children rushed inside, touching the desks, the blackboard, the books, things they had only dreamed of. Every woman in the crowd cried, remembering how their own daughters were once kept from learning. And as Amina stood in front of her new school, the same men who once doubted her walked up quietly and said, "Teacher Amina, we were wrong. You built hope from mud." Amina smiled, her eyes shining, and replied, "No, we built it together." Years after all her struggles, when Amina's school had become famous across the country, a small documentary crew arrived in her village. They wanted to tell her story to the world, the story of a girl who once studied under candlelight and now ran a school that changed hundreds of lives. Amina was nervous at first. Cameras and microphones surrounded her as she stood under the same mango tree where she once taught her first class. The crew asked her to walk them through her journey, from the little girl who hid scraps of paper under her bed to the woman who built a school from nothing. As they filmed, the villagers watched proudly from a distance. Mothers held their daughters close, whispering, "That's our Amina." The crew followed her through the classrooms, where children sat reading loudly, their faces full of excitement. The walls were covered with drawings, and the sound of laughter filled the air. When they asked her how she managed to build all of this after years of hunger, shame, and rejection, Amina smiled softly and said, "Because one day, a girl like me will read this story and know she's not alone." Her voice trembled a little as she continued, "I want her to know that it's okay to be told you can't, as long as you keep believing that you can. The cameraman lowered his camera for a moment, moved by her words. Even the sound crew wiped their eyes. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a living message of hope. The documentary team spent the whole day with her, filming her teaching, talking to her students, and meeting the people who once doubted her. Some of those same villagers now worked at the school, cleaning classrooms or helping cook meals for the children. Everyone had become part of her dream. When the filming ended, Amina sat alone under the stars outside her house. The air was quiet, filled with the sound of crickets. She thought about her younger self, the girl who had once cried behind the school window, the girl who almost gave up. A tear rolled down her cheek, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude. That night, as she was about to sleep, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a number she hadn't seen in years. It was from Mr. Odong, the teacher who once found her watching lessons through a cracked window. The message read, "Amina, I watched the news tonight. You proved us all wrong. You were the lesson we needed." Amina read it again and again, smiling through her tears. She whispered softly, "Thank you, sir." Then she looked up at the night sky and said, "If only that little girl could see me now." Somewhere far away, her story was already being shared, reaching the hearts of girls who were just like her, girls who would now know they were never alone. The afternoon sun was high over the village, and the smell of fresh paint filled the air. Amina stood watching as a group of young men painted the walls of the new classrooms she had built. Their laughter echoed across the schoolyard, but it wasn't the cruel laughter she remembered from years ago. These were the same boys who had once thrown stones at her when she tried to go to school. Back then, they had shouted at her, called her names, and mocked her for wanting to study. She could still remember running home in tears, clutching her torn notebook to her chest. But today, those same boys stood beside her with paintbrushes in their hands, helping her build a future for their children. As Amina handed one of them a bucket of paint, he paused and looked at her quietly. His voice was low and full of shame as he said, "I used to laugh at you, Amina. I used to say girls don't need school." He dipped his brush in the paint and continued softly, "But now I have a daughter. She's 5 years old. And when I look at her, I know I want something better for her. I want her to study here, in your school." Amina stopped for a moment, her heart swelling with emotion. She looked at him, this once proud boy who had become a father, and she saw change, real, human change. Her eyes glistened as she smiled and said gently, "Then my fight was worth it." The man nodded, blinking back tears, and went back to painting. Around them, the sound of children laughing filled the air. Some were sweeping the floor, others carrying chairs into the classrooms. The village that once doubted her was now building with her. The women brought water and food for the workers, singing songs as they cooked. The whole community was alive with hope, working together to finish the school before the rainy season came. Amina walked through the half-finished hallways, her fingers brushing against the new walls. The paint was still wet, the smell strong, but to her, it smelled like victory. She remembered the years when she stood outside the school window, watching other children learn while she was told she didn't belong. Now, every stroke of paint, every sound of a hammer, felt like healing, a promise that no girl in her village would ever have to beg for education again. When the sun began to set, the day's work ended. The walls were shining, glowing golden in the evening light. The young men stood together, looking at what they had built, their faces filled with pride. Amina turned to them and said, "Thank you for helping me." One of them smiled and replied, "No, Amina. Thank you for not giving up on us." As the children ran past her, playing and laughing, Amina looked at the school one last time and whispered, "Yes, it was all worth it." The day of the school's anniversary was warm and bright, and the whole village buzzed with excitement. Children wore their cleanest uniforms, parents brought flowers, and drums beat softly in the distance. Colorful ribbons hung from the classroom doors, and the walls gleamed with fresh paint. Amina stood quietly near the flagpole, watching everything she had dreamed of come to life. It felt like only yesterday she was that little girl hiding scraps of paper under her bed, studying by candlelight so no one would see. Now, the same place that once mocked her had gathered to honor her. When the mayor arrived, the crowd went silent. He walked to the front and smiled at Amina. "Today," he said, "we celebrate not just a school, but a woman who never gave up." He held up a shiny plaque, the sunlight catching on its golden edges. The crowd leaned in to read the words engraved on it, Amina's own words. They said girls don't deserve school, now they sit at the front of the class. The crowd clapped slowly at first, then louder and louder, until the whole village was on its feet, cheering and crying at the same time. Amina looked out at the faces before her, the mothers, the fathers, the children. In the front row sat little girls in blue uniforms, their books pressed proudly against their chests. She smiled, her eyes full of tears. "This is not just my story," she said softly. "It's ours." The crowd erupted again, chanting her name. And as the music started and the children sang, Amina looked at the school behind her, strong, alive, and full of dreams, and thought, the little girl who once learned in secret finally changed the world.